Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Molly Ryan. I'm the programs manager at the Harvard Art Museums, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's program on voting, activism, and art. Before we begin, I want to respectfully acknowledge that the Harvard Art Museums is situated on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people, and we strive to honor this relationship. So this year, the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage and our upcoming presidential election have brought voting rights to the forefront of the American political landscape. On campus, initiatives like the Long 19th Amendment Project, spearheaded by our colleagues at Schlesinger Library, have brought new attention to the fight for equal voting rights for women, while the Harvard Votes Challenge has worked to encourage students and staff across Harvard to prioritize voting and civic engagement. However, these conversations, in tandem with the ongoing global pandemic and the movement for Black lives, have also prompted important questions about disenfranchisement, especially for people of color in the United States. Though the 15th Amendment, passed in 1869, decreed that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, the next 100 years were marked by systematic attempts to suppress the voting rights of Black Americans, as well as by courageous efforts to fight discriminatory barriers to the ballot box and affirm the voting as a right of all citizens and indeed as a fundamental part of citizenship. In tonight's program, 4 curators will reflect on the role of art and artists in this work, focusing on select works from the collections of the Harvard Art Museums, Houghton Library. They will discuss how art can be seen as documenting and advancing the struggle for equal voting rights in the 20th century, and reflect on how these historic works might resonate in our contemporary political moment. Tonight's talk is co-sponsored by the Women in Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School, by Houghton Library, and by the Harvard Votes Challenge. And we're very grateful to these partners for collaboration and support. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. First, Mary Schneider Enriquez is the Houghton Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Harvard Art Museums. Her scholarly interests focus on 20th and 21st century global art, with a special emphasis on art from Latin America, art and politics, sculpture and installation, and the work of Mark Rothko. She has curated numerous exhibitions during her tenure at the Harvard Art Museums, most recently, Crossing Lines, Constructing Home, Displacement and Belonging in Contemporary Art, which she co-curated with Makita Best. Makita Best is the Richard L. Menschel Curator of Photography at the Harvard Art Museums. Her scholarly interests focus on 19th and 20th century American photography, with a special interest in photojournalism, documentary, war photography, and text and image works. Just this week, I'm excited to share that Makita has published a new book, Elevate the Masses, Alexander Gardner Photography and Democracy in 19th Century America, and that will be available through Pennsylvania State University Press. Next, Leslie Morris is the Gore Vidal Curator of Modern Books and Manuscripts at Houghton Library. During her 20-year tenure at Harvard, she has overseen the acquisition and cataloging of countless archives, including the collections of Gore Vidal and John Updike, and she has curated numerous exhibitions, including one that I loved, Altered States, Sex, Drugs, and Transcendence in the Ludlow Santo Domingo Library back in 2018. And last, but certainly not least, Catherine Minty is the John R. and Barbara Robinson Family Curatorial Fellow in Photography at the Harvard Art Museums. Cappy specializes in the history of photography in the United States, and at the Harvard Art Museums, she conducts research on the photography collections, develops collections-based photography installations, and assists in the organization of special exhibitions. Cappy has recently published several articles on voting rights, which you can read in the museum's Index magazine. And she has spearheaded a social media campaign on voting and visual arts, which I encourage you to check out on our Instagram channel. Now, if you have questions for our speakers during the conversation tonight, you can enter them in the Q&A box, which you should be able to locate at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be keeping an eye on this throughout the program. We'll do our best to address these questions at the end of the program if time allows, and we'll plan to wrap up by 8 p.m. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mary Schneider Enriquez to begin tonight's presentation.
Thank you, Molly, and welcome everyone. We're glad to have you here with us at this particular moment to be focusing on art, activism and voting, of course. The first image that you see on the screen is what, if you saw our Instagram account today, we also showed this work because it is absolutely spot on for what we need to be thinking about at this moment. This is a work by Jacob Lawrence. As you see, the title is The 1920s, The Migrants Cast Their Ballots, a screen print that he created in 1974. And he created this as part of a portfolio that was commissioned. There were 10 other artists, and this was his answer. I am going to talk about this work in the context of Jacob Lawrence's career, and then particularly what this means today for us. So would you mind, Cabby, going ahead one more? I'm going to jump into Lawrence's first kind of major work that put him in the spotlight of 20th century American artists was this work called the Migration Series. Lawrence himself was an African-American young man, very young when he became really a famous artist, I would say, which is really quite amazing because most artists don't have that opportunity in their 20s. His own parents were part of the Great Migration and came to the North from the rural South. He ended up first in Philadelphia, then in Harlem. At the age of 13, began taking art classes and went from there to and began studying under Charles Alston, and then later dropped out of school and came back to the community center and was taking classes under Augustus Savage, a sculptor. So he was really guided early on by major figures in the art world, and very early on was considered someone who was very talented. I should say in the 20s, he was also doing a lot of painting, a lot of work that led to the point that in the 30s, after much research, because he was also encouraged to do an enormous amount of research on what was the history of the African-American cultural movement, of all culture in general, the history of the people, and what his own family had gone through. The works you see here are 3 of 60 panels he created, beginning the research in the 30s for what was called the Great Migration Series. These 60 panels, all of which were 12 by 18 in scale, done in tempera on board, were to basically capture the history of the Great Migration, of the flux of more than hundreds of thousands of African Americans who came from the rural South to the North, seeking opportunity, a better life, education, jobs, improving the kind of life they had, including getting the vote. In the 3 images you see here, you see, and he did a variation of images, but each of which speak to a history and a present, and one speaks to the other. So it's a continuation of a story and a narrative. The one on the left, during World War I, there was a great migration, shows literally the individuals together. The image in the middle is after a lynching, the migration quickened. So he tells the story of their movement and why, the causes for the movement to the North. But in this particular image, very much a dramatic and very different way of describing figure, in which the whole of the table is forced up and her form is bent in sorrow and in suffering in a way that comes right out of the canvas the panel at us. And the far right image is in the North, the African-American had more educational opportunities. Over the course of his 60 different panels, he showed the causes and the movement and what they were seeking. So this image, in a very stark way, very dramatic and powerful, gives these 3 young girls a space writing on the clean chalkboard with the idea that there's opportunity for education there, which he very clearly states in other images was not a possibility in the South. He, in some of his other panels, talks about the insecurity of home life, the way the tenant farmers were treated, and the kind of oppressive violence against the individuals in the South, and reasons, in other words, building up why moving north was a new opportunity that they wanted to actually take advantage of. But very clearly, and one of the things that his colleagues talked about is he captured the life of people, and he himself talked about in the 40s that this was capturing a life that was ongoing. I mean, the Great Migration was 1910 to 1940, but in his years in New York in the early 40s, when he created this work. People talked about it on the street. This was not a historical past. It was part of life today, and the way in which he conveys this was very much a vivid statement. You have the next, please, Cappy. Thanks so much. So this leads us up to the work that we started with, but also an image from this Great Migration series, which, by the way, he did a whole group of other series. The Struggles is currently on display at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And in fact, one of the panels from that was just discovered. You may have seen the article in the Times just 2 weeks ago. So, and his importance and the attention that he drew to the lives and the suffering and the joys and the pride of the African-American people as a part of history is really key to his work. So what do we have here? The work on the left is another work from the Great Migration series, the 60 works he did in 1940-41, in which he explains in the North, they had the freedom to vote. So leaving the South to go to the North was about education, was about job, it was about opportunity, it was about the ability to be able to vote, which in fact has been very difficult for African Americans to vote in the South. By 1940, only 3% of the African American population was registered to vote, because there had been a whole series of laws over the years since the 15th Amendment that made sure that African Americans did not actually be able to vote. So he focuses on this in the Great Migration as another reasons for coming north. He explains this in a way that is very clear and powerful. You have a line of individuals waiting to get into the voting booth at the back of the room with only one, a policeman, the only white individual in this room, standing there at guard, but refrained from anything other than standing there, other than being incredibly intimidating, I will say, in his posture and manner and the way he's glaring at them. But there's this sense of certainty that they have the right to vote, which leads us to the more contemporary work in 1974. The idea that Jacob Lawrence chose to create this image in 1974 in answer to the question of what does independence mean to you is a telling statement of that moment in time, which I think absolutely is something we need to think about today, especially with the situation we're in as a nation, I would say. He portrays here vote, the migrants casting the vote. He makes very clear they're migrants. That means it ties to his Great Migration series and the people who've come north to have this opportunity of what independence means, what freedom means, and that ability to actually be a citizen, allowed to make a statement and to cast your vote with that certainty. He portrays this in brilliant color, the bright reds, yellows, blues, and golds of this, really making this come to life with the energy of hope, I think, very clearly. And there's an informality in they're all very serious about going to the back to the voting booth to make their vote, but there's a sense of community here. People are talking with each other, they're standing there participating in a process that we as Americans hold dear, and they were not allowed to hold that opportunity in their hands and be able to do it until they had the opportunity to go north, which is what he's framing for us in this image. So I think at this moment in time in which we are able to vote before the actual election day, we're able to mail in our votes. And we read in the newspaper even last week about areas in which people are standing in line to vote, and intimidation is what some people feel in certain areas of the country. I think that having this conversation tonight about activism, art, and voting is a really key one to remember, that some things have changed, but we must remain vigilant and continue to make those changes. And Lawrence captured that succinctly in his work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that really fantastic and timely discussion of Jacob Lawrence's work. So again, my name is Cappy Minty, and I am the John R. and Barbara Robinson Family Curatorial Fellow in Photography at the Harvard Art Museums. And in my brief presentation this evening, I want to build on the history that Mary just outlined for us of the Great Migration, and to consider how the rising number of Black voters in the North really began to transform American party politics and also campaign media in the 1930s and 40s. And I want to center my discussion on the two campaign posters that you see here, which were both produced by American artist Ben Shahn. And Sean is a really fascinating figure within 20th century American art, and I could talk for hours about him. But the key thing to know about Sean for the purposes of this talk is that he was very committed throughout his life to progressive politics and frequently made artworks that expressed his commitment to those causes. And we can see that in the two works that I'm showing you here. At left, we see a poster from the beginnings of Sean's career made in support of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. And then at right, we see a poster, or a print rather, that Sean made towards the end of his life in support of the civil rights movement. And it was Sean's commitment to progressive politics that led him to create the two posters that we see here, which were both made to support Franklin Delano Roosevelt's reelection in 1944. The poster at left, which is titled Welders, was made by Sean while he was working as the chief graphic artist for the Political Action Committee of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, which was an influential federation of labor unions. And in this poster, we see two helmeted welders, one black and one white, working together on a structure that we can just kind of glimpse here in the white welder's safety goggles. The poster at right, which is titled Our Friend, was commissioned by the National Citizens Political Action Committee, which was actually an offshoot of the CIO. And in this poster, we see Sean representing a kind of monumental profile of Roosevelt looking out over a crowd of cheering supporters. And while these posters are clearly very different in many ways, one of the key things that they have in common is they both represent the coalition of the Democratic Party, and specifically Roosevelt's coalition, as working class and, importantly, as multiracial. And we see this, I think, fairly explicitly in the Welders poster, and then a little bit more subtly in the Our Friend poster, where you might have noticed that among the cheering hands, we also see a black hand cheering here. And while today it might seem unremarkable that the Democratic Party would represent itself as the party of diverse working Americans, this is sort of a new vision of the party that was beginning to emerge really only after Roosevelt's first term. Prior to this period, very few Black voters, at least those who could vote, as Mary mentioned, during this period of significant voter suppression, at least those who could vote usually supported, usually didn't vote for the Democratic Party. In part, this was out of a historical allegiance to the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, and also because the Democratic Party was, through at least the 1960s, the party of white Southern segregationists. However, Roosevelt was able to expand the coalition of the Democratic Party during his presidency to include Black voters in the North. And he did so in part by enacting legislations and policies that began to improve the lives of Black voters in the North. Key among these were his New Deal programs, which were intended to alleviate the economic suffering of the Great Depression. And while certainly a number of these programs were discriminatory and excluded Black Americans, a number of them did aid Black families and workers. Also very important to the rising levels of support for Roosevelt among Black voters was the activism of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a supporter of the civil rights movement and who invited Black leaders to the White House to meet with her and the president. So these and other policies that Roosevelt implemented led to a significant kind of shakeup in the dynamics of party politics at this time. And we had an increased number of Black voters casting their ballot for Roosevelt and the Democratic Party. And I think Sean is clearly very aware of this shift and is reflecting that in the two posters that we see here. And I think in part, he is trying to speak to and appeal to Black voters in this time. And what I think is interesting about these posters is not just that they are kind of, documenting or maybe marking this moment of transition in party politics, but really that Sean is trying to imagine even something beyond that, to try to imagine, I think, a more kind of inclusive Democratic Party and really a more inclusive America than what existed in 1944. For example, the image of the black and white welder working side by side. This is not something that would have been a reality in many factory floors of the period. But for Sean, as a politically engaged artist, it was important for him not simply to kind of represent reality as it was, but also to try to represent an image of a better future that his audience could aspire to. I mean, he sort of communicates this clearly in a lecture that he gave at Harvard in 1956 when he told the audience, quote, "A truly creative artist is able to see the configuration of the future in present things and presses for change." And I think this is a really eloquent statement about the power that art and artists can have in advancing and transforming our politics and larger society. So thank you, and I'll pass the virtual mic to Leslie.
Thanks very much. So you may wonder what Hollywood star Kim Novak, here very elegantly lounging against a lamppost on a New York street, has to do with the object I chose to talk about this evening on the left. If you look closely, you'll see that the lead article in this issue of Colliers Magazine, dated August 17th, 1956, is "The Negro Voter, Can He Elect a President?" The author of the article is Theodore White, Harvard class of 1938, who 4 years later won the Pulitzer Prize for his The Making of the President, about the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon presidential context. White's papers are at the Harvard University Archives, and they include his reporter's notebook and the drafts for this article in Colliers. If we could have the next slide. This broadside, or small poster, was issued by Colliers and distributed to news agents to advertise this issue. The two photos on the right show how the poster might have been displayed, pasted on the flat sides of newspaper kiosks. This particular copy was not used that way, as the back is covered with scribbled mathematical calculations. Perhaps it was used by the news agent as scrap paper. It's remarkable that it survived, and really it only survived because it wasn't used for the purpose for which it was made. I've found no other copies of this in other library catalogs. There may be others, but it's what we in the library called printed ephemera, and that's not often very closely described in library catalogs. This same very striking graphic is used as an illustration to the article inside. The graphic designer's name is not known. The image is simple and has immediate impact. So for the 2 weeks that this issue of Colliers was current, you would see this everywhere across the city, and then it would vanish. Colliers could have chosen the more glamorous Kim Novak as a hook to lure people to purchase this issue, but instead chose to highlight the Black voter. Why was that? Well, Colliers was known for its investigative journalism, what Theodore Roosevelt called muckraking journalism, and this issue came out just before the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. In the article, White interviewed a number of Black politicians and voters in Chicago. So national attention was focused on politics at this point in time, and voting would be on many people's minds. It was certainly on my mind when this same image caught my attention in a dealer's catalog last spring. The presidential election of 1956 is probably not all that familiar to everyone, so I wanted to give just a brief account. It pitted Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, running for re-election against Democrat Adlai Stevenson, former governor of Illinois and the person Eisenhower had defeated 4 years earlier. Eisenhower was popular because of his military service in World War II, and he was personally very likable. His motto, after all, was, "I like Ike." He won in 1952, it was believed, because of the women's vote. Actually, contemporary papers call it the housewife vote, and that reminds me very much of the talk in this year's election about the importance of the suburban women's vote. An important issue in 1956 was H.R. 627, the Civil Rights Bill. The House passed it in July, with Republicans voting overwhelmingly in favor, but Democrats almost equally divided for and against. The bill would make it possible for the federal government to enforce Black voters' rights to vote. But after passing the House, it went into Judiciary Committee limbo and was never considered by the Senate. It wasn't until 1964, when President Johnson pushed through the Civil Rights Act, that the federal government was empowered to intervene to protect the right to vote. In 1956, Black voters might see the Republicans as their natural home, even though Black politicians acknowledged the great gains that had been made under Democrat Franklin Roosevelt's socially progressive administration. The other important domestic issue was enforcement of Brown versus Board of Education of 1954. Stevenson, who needed to keep the Southern Democrats happy, voiced his disapproval about the federal government enforcing school desegregation. Eisenhower managed to avoid expressing a direct opinion during the campaign, although he did not move quickly to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. So let's return to White's question, the question of the poster. Could Black voters elect the president? In 1956, 35% of Black Americans lived in the North and West, concentrated in the cities of 5 of the biggest electoral vote states: New York, California, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Michigan. These 5 states cast 156 electoral votes, just 110 short of a presidential majority. After Eisenhower received the endorsement of Democratic House Representative Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the Black momentum was really with the Republicans. In the end, Stevenson carried only 7 states, all in the South. Nearly 40% of the 18 million possible Black voters voted for Eisenhower. He was the last Republican candidate to enjoy such a high level of support from Black voters. So the answer to White's question was yes. Quoting from White in that article, "The new political power of the Northern Negro rests on 2 things: his irresistible growth in numbers and a fresh, superbly gifted leadership." Could we go to the next slide? Next slide. Thanks. So I want to make it clear that that poster doesn't exist in isolation in the library. It's part of a much larger group of printed ephemera that the library has been collecting over the years. And this is kind of a very random sample of some things that I just happen to have images for. But for the library to build a research collection of ephemeral pieces one by one is a very slow process. We've traditionally relied on collectors amassing such material and then giving it to us. There have been many very generous Harvard alums over the years, and they've had a huge impact on the development of the library's collections. So if there's someone out there who's been cleaning out closets during the pandemic, but who has always thought of Houghton Library as a place for high spot, rare books and manuscripts, please keep us in mind. We also love the ephemera of the streets. Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie, for that wonderful talk. My name is Makita Best. I'm the Richard L. Mitchell Curator of Photography. And when Molly asked us to think about objects for this program, I immediately thought of this image. And it is by Danny Lyon. I love teaching with these photographs and showing them to our university audience because Lyon was a young person when he made some of the most consequential photographs of the civil rights movement. He was from upstate New York and he learned about what was happening in the South and he traveled there, arriving in Cairo, Illinois, where he met the young leader at the time, soon one day to be the congressman. We actually just lost him recently, John Lewis. He meets John Lewis and actually lived with Lewis for a period of time while he began documenting the movement. And here is one of a number of images that he makes for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, as he travels through the South, documenting their activities. If we can go to the next image, please. So the focus of this image is this event, what was called Freedom Day in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And this was a voting registration initiative. Organizers had been working throughout Mississippi and had targeted this particular city for their activities because of the very low numbers of African-American registrants. The key figure here in Lyons's photograph, and you can see also in the right that the photographer is noticing this, other photographers are noticing this as well, is Fannie Lou Hamer. You see her standing or marching with the boy underneath the umbrella on the right, and then you see her standing near the top of the line in the hat on the sidewalk. The next slide, please. So Hamer was born in Mississippi in 1917 and born into poverty. She lived in her family, they were sharecroppers, and she became politicized in the 1960s, and she attends a meeting of the SNCC and joins the group and immediately becomes a key figure. She was known for her singing and for the way in which, well, she was a singer, and after seeing the power of her singing, actually that activity, singing, became very important to the work of the SNCC as an organizing tool, as a tool of activism. And so here she is one of the main focuses of these photographs. But I think what's fascinating is the way in which the Lyon in his photograph shows us this kind of intergenerational struggle, intergenerational work. Hamer here is one member of this line, and he positions this or shows this child in the foreground, this young boy, and Hamer herself next to an older boy. But he's showing us that this is an intergenerational movement. He's showing us the work of this group, marching in the rain. And then Hamer herself is, of course, key to this image. What fascinates me is how you can kind of think about different contexts for exploring these photographs, and just for this photograph and how rich Lyons's image is. So one focus is this event and this day. Another focus is Hamer herself. And then next image, please. We can also think about the role of photography in the movement. Lyons is one of the pioneers. His work is used by the SNCC for posters, and various other kinds of printed material. You would have probably encountered an image like this in one of their materials. Not necessarily this image, but other images would be used. So that's what he was doing, making images for the SNCC to use. And also, and they would put them out in the media, but they'd also create their own works. And you see, so on the right, you see on the middle, you see a poster, and then on the right, you also see the role of these kinds of images in broader publications. In this instance, a student publication from Mississippi. Next slide, please. Lyons was wonderful or Lyon is wonderful, still living, a wonderful photographer for the way in which he really thinks about telling a narrative over the course of images and really creating a sense of what it is like to be at that scene. And so the image of Hamer and the boy is a very intimate image. And then on the right, he shows us the law enforcement officers as this block. And notice how he positions himself on the street. So we get a real sense of what it must have been like to see this group of law enforcement officers marching toward the registrants and marchers that Hamer is standing with. And he's taking us into this moment, and the rain, the street is clear, and you see this block in a very dramatic way. Next image, please. So as I said, Hamer was known for her singing, and I think it's really fascinating how singing becomes an important aspect of Lyon's photography. And here, another context for understanding the significance of this image is his other image of students singing on the steps. And notice again the kind of intimacy of this scene and how he takes us, like, we're literally kind of standing below these young people, and he is very skillful at communicating the fact that they are young people, that they are small, but yet they are brave. Notice the young girl on the far left, and really all of them in the front row, how they are buttoned up in their little coats, but so bravely standing there, linking arms. He just frames the image so that we can see their arms and see how they are linking themselves as they stand and sing. The next image, please. And then, of course, what I also love about this image is how it shows us some of Lyon's own aesthetic concerns, his kind of aesthetic interests. If you notice, the boy on the right marching with Hamer is clapping, and so is the other boy in front of him. And this is the use of the hands is a wonderful motif in his work. And I love how it also appears in this image, also from our collection, from the March on Washington. And notice how just in both of these images, he's so aware of the energy of the moment. He could have made the image of the marchers at another moment in time, but he chose this moment in which they were clapping and showing us this kind of energy and this movement of that day, despite the circumstances in which they marched, the kind of wet and dreariness of the moment. And on the right, he's showing us these two young people, one who notices kind of pulling he's in the middle of clapping, and the energy is kind of moving into his body. He is closing his eyes and feeling this energy coming from his hands and pulling his hands down back into his body, whereas the boy on the right is snapping his fingers and raising his hand up into the air. So I love to look at these images together and think about how Lyon really conveys the kind of energy. I was saying that what I love about looking at these two images together is that they remind me of a wonderful skill that Lyon has in his ability to convey the energy of a moment. On the left, the kind of quiet determination and a sense of forward movement, and on the right, the young people marching at the March on Washington. I don't know if you heard the part where I was talking about the hands. On the left, you notice that the boy marching with Hamer is clapping. And I think that this is interesting in that Lyon chose this moment. He could have chosen a different moment, but I think that he is trying to convey the spirit and the use of song and of singing and of bodily movement in coordinating actions, but also in coordinating the spirit of these protests. And on the right, you see him also, paying attention to hands. The young boy on the left is, clapping and pulling the energy into his body and closing his eyes, whereas the boy on the right is raising his arm triumphantly and snapping his fingers, and energy is moving away from him. So I like looking at these two photographs together to think about Lyon and his own work to document this movement and to create an aesthetic from and through it. In the next image, finally. Finally, this thinking about this topic got me thinking about how this the struggle for voting rights, for the African American struggle for voting rights, really contributes to the national iconography uh, of our country. And you can see it in this contemporary image by Joshua Dudley Greer. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Makita. That's going to be a kind of fantastic transition for where we go next as I kind of try to wrap this up a little bit. And I just want to return briefly to this great quote from Ben Shahn about the idea of a truly creative artist as one who advocates for change. And clearly that's something that we've seen in all of the historic works that we've looked at, and of course is a part of an ongoing tradition. So to round things out, I just wanted to look at some more contemporary works from our collection and also that are being made in this moment now in support of campaigns and also to get out the vote. So I wanted to start by looking at this portfolio in the collection of the Harvard Art Museums titled Portfolio for Obama, which was made in support of Barack Obama's historic 2008 presidential campaign. And many well-known contemporary artists contributed prints to the portfolio, including, as you see here, Ed Ruscha and Julie Meritou. And what's, I think, interesting about many of the works in this portfolio is that they represent a departure from a number of the other works we were looking at earlier, which focus primarily on the figure. And so here we see many artists in the portfolio sort of embracing the language of abstraction or focusing more closely on text as a means of political persuasion. And that's something that we might discuss a little later on. And then I just wanted to highlight some really great organizations that are partnering with artists or artist-led that are creating work to help get out the vote right now. One that I think many of you might have encountered is planyourvote.org. And if you haven't encountered it yet, I suggest getting on their website as soon as this talk is over. They've partnered with a number of fantastic contemporary artists to make these sort of works like the ones that you see here that you can download for free on their site and then repost to your various social media platforms as a way to encourage your friends, family, and other followers to vote. And I think this really speaks to the growing importance, of course, of the digital sphere as a way to campaign and encourage especially young people to participate in elections. And then finally, I wanted to discuss this really interesting organization for freedoms that I actually think Ben Shahn would have absolutely loved. It was formed in 2016, and it's essentially a political action committee that was created by artists and is intended to encourage artists to be more involved in contemporary politics. And they've been doing some fascinating projects since 2016, including at Wright, a billboard project where they've commissioned billboards and installed them across the country from really important contemporary artists like Carrie Mae Weems. And then at left, you see one of the more recent political posters that they produced, this one by For Freedom's co-founder, Hank Willis Thomas. And I really like the slogan of this poster, "Together we are awake," reminding us all, I think, of the importance of collective action in terms of bringing about change, not only in terms of getting out the vote next week, but everything else that we can do together beyond it. So on that note, I will end the presentation and we can discuss.
So We have a couple of questions in the Q&A box that we can start with, and then if the panelists have questions for each other, I just want to make sure that you also have time and freedom to do that. So one question about the Jacob Lawrence works that we discussed. Did Jacob Lawrence ever depict racial tensions in the North in his painting series?
Yes, it's on my head. In fact, in the same group of the migration series of 60 works, he does include very specific images of the tension of workers, northern workers, and violence against the immigrants from the South, the African-American community now taking jobs. He also does another image where they were brought, African-American migrants were brought in to become strike breakers. Companies would hire them. So they were put right in the line of violence in that way. So there are actually a whole series of at least 4 or 5 in addition works that he very specifically, he speaks to the realities in both ends of this.
One other specific question about the Jacob Lawrence images is one of our participants is noticing the credit line for that work of art, which comes from Laurel Art, a division of Lowe's Theaters. And they're curious what the connection is between the artist and that company.
It wasn't a particular connection with the artist. In fact, they were an example of early on, a number of companies began to support the arts. So back in, I mean, I vividly remember in the 70s, you would go to the IBM site on Madison Avenue in New York, and they had a gallery where they had contemporary art. So the arts, and Philip Morris was a big funder of exhibitions. In this case, this particular group funded this portfolio to celebrate the bicentennial, 1976. They selected 10 artists to do works within this portfolio, including Marisol and Robert Indiana. It was a range of artists, and it was more of a, I think probably for them, to be perfectly honest, it was a good thing for them to be a part of, to be supporting the arts in this way. In what would be a more accessible series of prints, but it also allowed these artists, I mean, I think given the context of 1976, asking the question, what does independence mean to you, makes a lot of sense. And it also allowed for some really interesting work to come out of it. So, but he was not specifically connected with the corporation.
Thank you. One of our participants also noticed or was interested to notice that the Lawrence work was also transferred from the student print rental collections to the permanent collection of the Harvard Art Museums. And I imagine the ephemeral nature of that print iteration maybe was the reason that it landed in the print rental first, but now we can display in the galleries at the art museums and not just in dorm rooms, but that we still have plenty of prints to share in that way.
Yes. In fact, that is one example of several pretty important works that started out, as prints that came into the collection and part of the print rental. And now we have had to bring some of those back into the collection and not allow them to be rented, unfortunately, by the students.
Maybe, Leslie, could you speak a little bit about how objects related to voting, for example, do you bring them into the collection? Do you look specifically for them, or are they also coming as part of someone's papers and they're kind of discovered? I'm just wondering about how do you actually, how do those works come into Houghton? Do you just discover them as part of other kind of acquisitions that come in, or in gifts, or do you actually seek those out as a subject area to collect in?
Well, for that particular object, I wasn't looking specifically for something about voting. But it was such a striking object. And then when I knew more about the occasion for its creation, it seemed to me that it fit very well into kind of a teaching collection that we've been trying to build over the last 20 years to really support faculty and student interest in the 60s and the 70s. To me, what was interesting about it was the Civil Rights Bill of 1956, which, you know, I always think of civil rights, the 60s, but it was a much longer continuum. So that's really why I bought it, to bring that kind of single thing into the collection to add to something. But things come into the collection in all kinds of different ways. The Gore Vidal papers, he ran for office twice. So there's certainly political and voting related ephemera in the Vidal papers. And people, I can't recall that anyone's given us anything associated specifically with voting. But since the exhibition that I did on sex and drugs, we've actually been given quite a lot of printed ephemera that relates to those topics. You know, people from the 60s, you know, getting rid of stuff and saying, oh, well, you know, I have these zines. Would you be interested in having them? So it's kind of a shift away from kind of the high spot things to considering culture more broadly. So, you know, my object, I don't know who the designer was. I don't know who the artist was, but it fits into what we're trying to document.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're all dealing with works that are, you know, my work is a real-time work. It's a multiple. Mary, you know, Lawrence is, you know, working in painting, but it's not traditional painting in terms of, you know, worked up oils and surfaces. Everyone is working in a, you know, a very speedy, kind of rapid process. And that's very palpable in all of these works, even in the Lawrence. I mean, it's very, it's very, you know, designed and, you know, calculated, but it's also, you can feel the energy in it.
Yeah.
And it's for all of us, it's all works on paper or works that have that kind of immediacy in terms of medium, or in terms of the artist's hand, in terms of its platform. Immediacy is a key aspect here, and that's probably because they are works that want to reach people in a quick, you know, manner. But I think that's also part of why they are so compelling.
Yeah.
I would add, sorry, with immediacy, I would say accessibility. I mean, they're making them both physically, but also in terms of message. I mean, the posters, but the photographs as well. And Lawrence, it is really in scale, and actually Ben shines the same thing. I think it's speaking to the moment in a way that it is right there for you, as opposed to reserved and removed and made precious, let's say.
Yeah, and just to sort of build on that, I just wanted to add that in some of the Sean posters that we have in the collection, you can actually see around the edges like tape marks where there used to be tape, where this was hung up. So you know that these were used, and like the Sean was hung in union halls across the country, and we have some photographs that he actually took seeing his own posters out in the world. So even though we're kind of looking at them in this very isolated way, it is very important to recognize this broader life that they had in the real world.
Yeah, which becomes interesting when you try to hang them as a curator. We have this problem. It's like, should we show those marks? Well, that is part of what they are, but it's also a conservation issue. And then how do we show it? You know, do you show it in a frame with a black, you know, in a black frame? How do you preserve that, the sense of it as an object?
Yeah.
Well, what really struck me in looking at all of these slides was, you know, as Mary said, the timeliness, the immediacy of all of it, but also there is this timelessness as well. So many of those images, you could just, you know, take it and use it in another context. And I think that's what makes visual communication so powerful in a way, that it divorces itself from the text and be repurposed in a way. I mean, I Lawrence, it's just amazing, just beautiful.
Yeah, actually, oh, sorry. I was just going to say the choices that Cappy made of the contemporary work on Organize Your Vote. Actually, I didn't get the exact name right, but even some of those, the one I noticed in the middle with just the black on white, to your point exactly, Leslie, that could be used. It could have come from the past. It could be used well into the future. It was very that. I mean, not just that one, but that one I'm just going to use as an example.
Well,
Really,
and even though a lot of them employ like elements of realism, like, you know, they're photographic, like even the Sean, you know, they look photographic, or they still retain a sense of contemporary. They still feel contemporary.
Yeah, I think in part because that kind of aesthetic has sort of come back in some ways. I think we're very much kind of thinking about, especially the moment of like the 30s and 40s, or even an artist like Shepard Fairey, his work that's kind of, I think, echoing someone like Sean from that moment.
Russian Revolution, Sean,
Yes.
yes, all of that.
Mexican muralism. It's
all other movements that also, going back to my interest in Lion, the hands, right? The role of the hands. John too. It was all about, you know, the hand.
I wanted to add one little, Makita, having your explanation about the focus on the hands and talking about her musical abilities. I ended up seeing those photographs as you began to compare them with others, and really actually he is able to convey sound as well. I mean, when you talk about the hands and the clapping and the snapping and her singing and the people, the young girls all tied together singing with their, I thought I can almost hear and feel what is being conveyed here. And he does it, the focus and detail, as you so well described, really brought me to that.
Yeah, certainly. And if you think about it, it's kind of an odd thing to photograph someone singing. It's kind of an odd thing, or clapping, or this kind of movement, but it really does convey this sense of the role of this, of sound. And he does take you into the spirit of these moments.
That's great.
So it is 8 o'clock. We could talk for much longer, but I think that notion of timeliness feels really important. So I want to thank you all very much for sharing these works with us and for helping us reflect on voting and sort of the preciousness of that right and the importance of all of us using it. I'm sorry I didn't get to every question in the chat. Our colleague Lauren did call attention to another series by Hank Willis Thomas. So there's a link there to his Wide Awakes project if people want to take a look at that. And Cappy, one person was curious if you could repeat the Ben Shahn quote that you ended your talk with, but I think you actually have another Ben Shahn work.
Yes, I can share that very quickly. I'm so sorry. Sorry, I have actually exited my PowerPoint. I'm sorry, everyone's seen my screen.
Here we go.
But we will go to the very last slide. Apologies. A great way to re-experience all these images.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A wonderful
review. Okay, and this is the one image with Sean actually with the tape mark. So you can all take that as you leave. And of course, to remember to vote by November 3rd. So thank you again for joining us.